to another video, and today I'm recording another episode in my EV series, which should be pretty interesting. So, the GM EV1 was released in 1997. So, as you know, usually car eras start about a decade before they get popular, or at least a decade before the first generation comes out. So this was like the first generation of EVs before they were popular, right? GM was trying something new, and that was GM. Now, one thing I want to talk about, GM used to be much better than it is now. As if you know now, they make one car, spread it across all their models, and then brag about how they're so much better than other cars. Meanwhile, Mary Barra knows that the company's going zero. Nada. Nowhere. Running on a treadmill. That's pretty much it. So, essentially, back when GM was still interesting and tried things, they came out with the EV1. One of the first generations of EVs ever, especially commercially available. Very interesting stuff. Now, the GM EV1 was, of course, bought back, but one thing I want to mention about the GM EV1 is that GM actually cared about this. I mean, it's very often that, very rare, not very often, that GM actually cares about something, and in this case, they actually put their emblem on it. Like, if you don't know, GM is kind of like the master corporate overlords of Chevy, GM, Cadillac. You never see the GM logo anywhere. Not at all. I mean, yes, there's GMC, which is their official GM brand. They've never made a car of their own. They're all just rebrands. I mean, come on. The actual GM logo, like GM, is never shown anywhere except on the GM EV1 and some Chevrolet Avios from the early thousands. Very weird cars to pick to put your official logo on. Anyway, if you don't know, GM later gave up on the EV1 and brought out the Bolt and Volt, which is definitely not as good. So, essentially, GM was trying something new, then they realized, oh yeah, we're a greedy, crappy company now and we can't figure out how to make cars right. That means that we should ultimately just scrap the entire idea. I mean, who needs innovation? We're GM. We just need rebadge engineering. That's all we need. Believe it or not, a lot of the people, the same people that squeak and whine about Toyota not having an EV, Toyota also made an EV in the 1997s. Who would have thought, in 1997, who would have thought that Toyota would have made one of the first ever EV crossovers? Yeah, well, Toyota's not Tesla nowadays, so, yeah. So they did actually make a RAV4 EV. There were 328 open to the public, and yeah. Essentially, this was, again, just Toyota and GM knew that this type of, that this type of technology was out there and able to be used, and they were just kind of testing the water, right? So, at the same time, Toyota didn't know what would catch. Would hybrids catch, or would EVs catch? We both know how that story went. Well, if multiple people are watching, everyone knows how that story went. Hybrids caught on, Toyota discontinued the EVs after 2 generations. It was fine. That's just how it went. GM proved to be the start of something big. This is from the archive, of course, from Car and Driver. GM's real attempt to add an electric car. Couldn't go fast on a charge, but it was a glimpse of the future. This was just, again, GM trying something. This was the first real generation, right? Now, keep in mind, this wasn't the first, right? This isn't what I like to call the competitive zone. So there's the start of the generation where it's one car proving what it can be, and then later down the road there's the first ever war, which is multiple car companies coming out with similar cars that compete against each other in the market. So for an instance, Honda and the Honda the Honda Insight and Toyota Prius were the first ever war, and then I believe there was a hybrid somewhere in the early 1990s, the first ever hybrid that was kind of inspired both of those projects. So the hybrid air phase was a little bit different than the EV phase. It kind of had 2 stages, funny enough. The EV phase kind of had 2 stages. So essentially, right, let's just do this. The GM EV1 was just GM trying something. So when would the first ever wars happen? Believe it or not, it would be with Tesla. Now, 2008, the Tesla Roadster. Yeah, the Tesla Roadster. Now, you may know this Lotus Elise body shell. Essentially, Elon Musk bought his way into Tesla in 2004 after, what's that thing that he made? PayPal? Yeah, after PayPal sold big, and he just bought his way into the company because he thought it'd be cool. Just reminding everyone, Elon Musk isn't some sort of car person. He didn't buy into it because he thought it was, the future. He bought into it because he thought it was cool. I mean, come on, it's Elon Musk. Anyway, so essentially, it was an EV. There's not much more to say about it. It was cool, right? But this sparked the first generation of the EV wars. This was weird. It was a weird little sporty thing. keep in mind, this is essentially the Honda Insight of this war. This radical new sporty thing. EVs are weird enough, so why don't we just make it as weird as possible? Hopefully that'll attract the right buyers, right? So if this was the radical Honda Insight EV that, just testing the waters, what would be the Prius, the sensible choice, right? Just your average, everyday Joe grocery getter EV. What would take the Prius's place if this was the radical Insight? Coda. Now, a lot of people like to think that Coda is just some aging wheels car and it didn't really exist, but actually Coda played a very big part in the first ever, war of EVs. So this is the 2009 concept. Now, remember, hybrids, right? A lot of people like to make the comment Coda was lazy. Why would they choose a foreign car? If you don't know, they chose a Chinese ripoff of a Kia Rio, Hyundai Elantra, something. They chose a Chinese ripoff of that to steal the body shell from and make it an EV. Now, a lot of people like to say, well, why wouldn't they just design their own body shell? First of all, that costs a lot. Why wouldn't they go with an American car body shell? Easier. It was a lot to pay for it. And also, they only really needed the shell. Since EVs are so radically different from regular cars, and they're set up completely differently, they would need to, seriously make some modifications. Think about how different hybrids are to a regular car. It still has a regular combustion engine. It still functions like a regular normal car, for the most part. There's not too many differences. You just need a small little battery and a little IMA or hybrid synergy drive, depending on what model it is, right? So they're not too radically different. You just squish the engine over to one side, put the little transmission-y thing and motor over there, put the battery in the back, that's it, right? EVs are radically different. Single motor, entirely different direct drive transmission, if you can even call it that. Very, very different. Everything's electric. Everything needs to be custom. So that's why they went with a foreign body shell, and it makes sense. Now, Coda didn't start selling cars until 2011. But in 2009, it was definitely a concept, and people knew that it was coming. See, the Tesla Roadster wasn't what I would like to call competitive. It was more just for fun. In fact, in 2011, I believe they only sold 3,000 of these. Whew. Anywho, there was also a third car. That's right, a third car. Now, if this is the Honda Insight and the other one's the Prius, remember, this being the weird, well, it's weird enough anyway, so why don't we just go full weird and hope that we attract buyers, one. And this being the sensible grocery getter, hey, maybe you can just go get groceries with your EV power and drive home and it'll be fine. Where does this third car fit into? Well, believe it or not, these were both small companies at the time. Tesla was this tiny little startup, so was Coda. Now, there were WeGo and some other small little EV fart startup companies around that time that a lot of them gained traction and then burnt up, much like Coda did. We'll get into that later. I'm just covering the mains, right? So we had Tesla, Coda, which actually sold more cars than Tesla in 2012. Very interesting. Then we had Nissan. Nissan was kind of both. In this case, it's kind of more like the Prius, and yet more like the Insight. So, it's like taking the grocery getter. It's like in between, right? The Tesla Roadster is all out weird. This is just some weird, some grocery getter. And the Coda is just full, your average dad fart sausage roll sedan thing. Just normal, just fine, right? And this was just kind of weird. This was just Nissan trying something new, stealing Honda's interior. They never minded it was bad interiors anyway, for the most part. And so this was just kind of like in between. It was some weird, some normal. And in 2009, this was, of course, just a concept. Now, it would start sale in 2010. So let's look at that. Remember that Toyota EV I showed you? That's right, they didn't give up on EVs. A lot of people like to say that in 1997, Toyota tried EVs, they failed, they gave up. In 2010, believe it or not, they also had a RAV4 EV, the second generation. And it sold. I mean, it was fine. It wasn't a big player. It wasn't that important, but it was interesting. And considering Toyota has had such a history with EVs, when they refuse to do them now, I'm going to get into that later of why Toyota refuses to do EVs now, but they did them in the past. EVs are different now. I'll get into that in a future episode. But essentially, this was the second generation. This was a modern RAV4. It's interesting, that this was also going up against Tesla, the Nissan Leaf, and Coda for, the first top spot, right? No one knew what was going to stick. So, 2010 rolls around, the Nissan Leaf is officially in production, and it's weird and wacky as ever. Yep, always weird. Ugh, I'm sorry. That charge port's hideous. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. 2010, Coda was starting to make cars. They weren't officially, but they were. And it was just it's kind of still an interesting company. They were just, you know what I mean. Just fine, right? They were just kind of boring. They were just kind of making the normal EV car, right? I really like Coda. I thought it had a lot of guts back in the day. I thought it had a lot of traction. I wasn't really a fan of Coda as much as I was appreciative of them making normal EVs. We'll see where that all went off the tracks. 2010, Tesla was still exclusively selling the Roadster, which still wasn't gaining any traction. And in 2012, right, again, we're bumping up, so we've done the early 1990s, then the early, before 2010s, the pre-wars, 2010s, in my opinion, hybrids were solidified. They were the choice, they were amazing, they were now solidified in our culture. 2010 was the time where EVs would have their battle. Which EV would remain on top, which EV would blah, blah, yeah, blah, 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 blah. You know, exactly. It's just, this was the time that EVs were having their war 10 years after hybrids had their war and were solidified, which means EVs, of course, were solidified by 2020. That's kind of how it works, right? So we have like 10 years before the initial war of going mainstream. 10 years before that, we have like the car that proves that it can do it, something like that early hybrid car or the GM EV1. 10 years after that, big mainstream car companies and small little startups like Toyota and Honda, Nissan, Tesla, Coda, they realize that they can make cars and profit off of this, so they start doing that. Their cars fit out. And then, by 10 years after that, their technology is solidified, and, just like hybrids, everything was a hybrid. Nowadays, everything's an EV. That's just kind of how it works, right? So, by 2012, things were different. First of all, by 2010, like I said, by 2012, let's just get into this, Tesla had the Roadster. That was just it. Very boring. By 2012, however, Tesla had the Model S, which was very interesting. Now, it's very weird to see a Tesla with a decent interior. I know, it's just odd to see it. These actually were great cars. They were fine. They were big. They were a little bit big for me. I thought the touchscreens were awful. My personal opinion, they were fine. This was where EV started to gain traction, and Tesla started to realize that, hey, if you're already spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on an EV, you might as well make it nice. So that's when the Model S luxury sedan was introduced. Very nice. 2012, Coda was officially selling their vehicle. It sold very well. I believe it actually outsold Tesla this year. A very, very good car. I mean, now, yes, they were built cheaply. Yes, they had issues. The first generation Toyota Priuses caught fire. The first generation Insights were ugly and also caught fire. Every single first generation of something will have some problems. They were poorly built. Teslas, I mean, you know how that goes. They're still poorly built today. That's just kind of how it went, right? By 2012, the Nissan Leaf was just leafing it up. Just fine. Like I said, the interior reminds you of a Versa, with being just slightly weird enough with that bow tie to just make you, I mean, that's just kind of what it made me think of. Just, what is this? So it's like a Versa steering wheel, so it is like a normal Nissan. And it's styled like a normal Nissan, but it has an egg shifter like the Prius. And some weird white plastic for some reason, like piano black with I just thought it was very weird for Nissan to go this route. Also, the blue Nissan badge, don't see that a lot. So, moving into 2015, this is where the EV war started to subside, and instead of competing with each other, seeing which startup was going to take off, Nissan and Tesla take off, and Coda, I can't think of, three words to describe what happened to Coda. Crash and burn, really. They went bankrupt. They had all kinds of issues. They were bought out. They now make autonomous driving vehicles, or they test their technology on old Codas that didn't sell, so all of them. Just very interesting, right? By 2015, Tesla had the Model X, which was, of course, your sporty, fun, not off-roader at all crossover, which was very interesting. You, of course, also had the Nissan Leaf, which was unchanged. I mean, they gave it some better wheels that weren't absolutely fugly, and a slightly nicer interior. Other than that, it was pretty much unchanged, right? 2015, EVs were solidified. Now, I just brought this up so that you could see this long list of EVs. A few of them I put in here. The plug-in hybrid Volt, yes, that was a thing. No, I'm not going to talk about it because it was a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. It was very good. Yes, it's an EV. Yes, it has a range extender, blah, blah, blah. We very much get it. Now, 2015, why I say it was solidified. Now, the EV wars were very different at this time because Tesla like, this war was very different. The original hybrid war was between the Honda Insight and Toyota Prius, with the Toyota Prius being the sensible grocery getter, kind of like Coda, with being just a normal sedan, and the Roadster being like the Insight, a sporty little car that was weird. Well, this time, the opposite happened. Instead of the Toyota Prius winning because people wanted something sensible, EVs, the batteries, their motors, everything was already expensive, so wacky and weird won. That's right, wacky and weird won over sensible, which means Coda crashed and burned. Tesla and Nissan both survived. Nissan became the new Coda. Nissan became the new sensible thing, even though it looks like a non-juke. Very weird. Just overall, just a very strange thing. I always expected Coda to go farther than they were. Yes, they had business practice issues. Yes, they had car building issues. But yeah, so by 2015, Tesla and Nissan had kind of won. Tesla was becoming mainstream, by which I mean they were selling a lot of cars. And the Nissan Leaf was just, if you couldn't afford a Tesla, you got this to take your kids to school. That's just kind of how it went, right? So the Nissan was if you wanted something sensible, and the Tesla was if you wanted something else. Now, keep in mind, this isn't an echo chamber. Other EVs did indeed exist, like I showed with the list before. There's one EV during this time period, my favorite EV out of this time period, since, Toyota didn't give me anything. Yeah, the RAV4 EV was fine. It was fine. It was kind of mashed potatoes. It was fine. So, of course, Tesla progressed. So, of course, did Nissan. We also had the Spark EV from 2015. Very weird, very fiery, very ugly GM. It's ugly. I'm sorry. It's ugly. It's just not a good EV. And I'm not saying that it's not a good EV. The range numbers weren't good. The economics weren't good. The price wasn't good. It wasn't good. It just wasn't good. For Lug Nuts, it was ugly. It was GM. This is GM now. Kind of, exactly. This is kind of Honda. GM is playing Honda here. We had the EV1. We threw it out only for EVs to succeed. Honda doing that with the Insight where Toyota won, and then they did that radical, cross tour thing. Very, very weird. Why do all companies just throw pissy fits when they don't win wars? Very weird. Anyway, so GM, yes, we also had the Volt, which was this plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. It was also very weird, yes. Very, 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 very weird. You can see GM was kind of playing on both sides of the coin here. They had, the weird Volt, and then, your mom's EV. Anyway, my personal favorite, is the e-Golf. Now, if you don't know, the Volkswagen, there was the e-Up, and I made a video on that. Very inaccurate, by the way. I love making inaccurate videos. Not. Anyway, so, essentially, the e-Golf was just a normal EV version of the Golf. If I had to buy an EV, I would buy the e-Golf. It has, 75? Yeah, 75 miles of range. It came out in 2012. Very good car. It was fine. That's it. It was fine. It was the most normal. It was the most sensible. It was the most practical. I liked it the most. There we go. And then, of course, we had the electric drive B-Class. This one, it was just weird. It was like an SUV, but wagon. Ugh. This was back when I can't even describe this era of Mercedes. They had no idea what they were doing. They were just maybe instead of SUVs or sedans, two popular things, we'll make a minivan-looking wagon, not off-roader, not SUV crossover, and make it electric. Very, very weird. Anyway, so this is my video on the first generation. Essentially, weirdness won over practicality, and that will be a theme that will stick with EVs for years to come. Of course, the Model S was always being sold. The Model Y would be instituted in 2020 later on. And of course, the Model E would be thrown in there somewhere. So, yeah, Model 3. Yeah, not Model E. Model 3. Anyway, so, yeah. That's pretty much it. This is my video on the first generation of EVs. Please tell me how interesting this was and how amazing it was, so that I can feel good about myself. No, I'm joking. But seriously, this is my video on the first generation. Now, this will be a series, and I'm very excited to make more. So, yeah.